Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance Network and 90.1 KPFT Houston. And today I'm very excited to bring to you another important guest as we continue our discussion and our exploration of everything that's going on related to COVID-19. There's a lot of theories out there. There's a lot of people putting out, I would say, faulty information. And today's guest is somebody who I think has the credentials and the experience to ask some important questions that I haven't seen anybody else putting forward. So please welcome to the show, Miss Stephanie Seneff. Did I say your last name correct?
You did. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you
awesome.
very much for having me.
I appreciate you taking the time with us this morning. Before we get into your really important piece, I'd like for you to give everybody a little bit of your background and anything else you want to share with us.
Okay, yes. I'm basically born and bred MIT. I went there as an undergraduate, majored in biology. Went to graduate school, got a Ph.D. in electrical engineering and computer science. So I've got a pretty broad scientific background. Spent most of my career all at MIT, but most of it developing precursors to things like Amazon Echo and Siri. So spoken dialogue interaction with computers. We built really the first interactive system with a computer way back in the 1980s. So I've been at that for a long time. About 12 years ago, I got concerned about the autism rates, which were going up dramatically. And when you do the math, you get very nervous because the situation looks pretty grim. In the 2030s, I think we can expect a large number, increasing numbers of kids getting autism. And we just had a 10% increase. The CDC announced it in the middle of all the COVID-19 noise. Nobody even heard it. You know, it keeps on going up. It's going to take us down. I think once we've got so many kids with autism growing up, now we're going to hit that burden is going to hit the adult population. And we don't have adequate facilities for taking care of them. So I'm very worried about autism. That was what drew me into this whole space. I spent 5 years searching, looking for, I can do, my computer skills allow me to do statistical analyses of time trends of diseases and things like that. And so I was looking for things that were also going up in step with autism. And I was striking out. I spent 5 years. I knew a lot about autism at that point, very complicated disease, many symptoms. And I'd been spending 5 years looking at various toxic chemicals and striking out. And so I thought something about maybe antibiotics because they're definitely gut dysbiosis. I saw a lot of problems with the gut. And I happened to hear a talk by Professor Don Huber, a 2-hour presentation on glyphosate. This was about maybe 7 or 8 years ago. It blew my mind. I mean, I was like, wow, this is it. It was a really stunning experience for me. And I didn't know what glyphosate was when I walked into the room. And by the end of those 2 hours, I was convinced I had found my answer with respect to the most important toxic chemical in our environment associated with autism. And I to this day, I believe that's true. I now know a lot more about glyphosate. I've been basically eating and drinking and sleeping glyphosate papers, and just really sinking my teeth into this topic, and then finding it to be an extremely fascinating molecule with a very devious and insidious mechanism of toxicity that explains why it's causing not only autism, but a huge list of diseases. We have an epidemic in diabetes, obesity, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, dementia, various autoimmune diseases, gut dysbiosis, inflammatory gut, all these things, pancreatic cancer. I mean, it's just, the list goes on and on. All these things are going up dramatically in our population. You can see the plots. And Nancy Swanson was a researcher who produced a paper together with colleagues that had over 30 different diagrams of very, very strong correlations between glyphosate and all these different diseases. Many of these diseases are risk factors for COVID-19, and I think that's no accident. I think what it's telling us is that glyphosate exposure is a risk factor for a bad outcome with COVID-19.
Well, definitely I appreciate that background. Before we go further into glyphosate and get into the nitty-gritty of that, I do want to pause to just ask you if in your research, obviously this is a controversial idea, but there are folks that put the blame towards things like vaccine. I've even seen some EMF researchers, radio frequency radiation researchers talking about potential for autism as well. Did you on your path, did you look into those areas as well? And did you still come up feeling glyphosate is the strongest potential?
Yeah, I did look into those areas, and I do agree with those people. I think both of those are factors. I mean, we have a lot going on. There's a lot of change in the last 40 years in our society and how we're living, and all of these increasing availability of the internet and all the different electric, EMF noise that we're experiencing because of that. And I've seen papers, Martin Pall in particular, I've read his work where he shows that EMFs cause calcium uptake by the cells. Well, it turns out glyphosate does too. So they're working synergistically with each other. There have been several papers that have shown various cell types in neurons and cells in the testes and cells in the adrenal glands that are taking up calcium in response to glyphosate. So those are working synergistically to cause harm. And it's the same thing with the vaccines. The aluminum in the vaccines, I think, is definitely a contributor to autism. And in fact, it's been shown that autistic brains post-mortem have high levels of aluminum in them, just like the Alzheimer's brains do. But again, glyphosate chelates metals. And I wrote a paper together with colleagues explaining theoretically how glyphosate can be expected to bind to aluminum. Two glyphosate molecules will wrap around an aluminum ion and hide its +3 charge, allow it to get easily across the gut barrier, across the brain barrier, particularly into the brain stem, which is outside of the brain barrier. And I particularly focused on the pineal gland. I think that glyphosate is bringing aluminum to the pineal gland and delivering it there. And then it's becoming dysfunctional. And that's why we have an epidemic in sleep disorder, which is because melatonin is being disrupted. And that also matches perfectly with the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops, the increase in issues of sleep issues.
Well, I appreciate that. Definitely something that we've talked about here on my show recently is the synergistic effect of various environmental toxins. I covered a study about a week ago that was looking into 5G and the concerns about radio frequency radiation. And what the researchers stated and basically concluded is that most of the studies that have come out that they're studying basically our exposure in a lab instead of taking into consideration all the other environmental toxins, glyphosate, aluminum and these other things. And when they combine together, that there is that very dangerous synergistic effect. So I appreciate you bringing light to that. Let's get into the piece that you just recently put out that I was really blown away by the amount of information in there. Obviously, like you've said, you've been researching this for quite some time. What is your main hypothesis in relation to COVID-19? You mentioned the waterways and glyphosate runoff. Let's get into some of the specifics of that.
Right. Well, the thing that I really zeroed in on, which was new for me, was the possibility. And again, it's all at this point speculation because nothing's been proven. But it seems to me there's a possibility that glyphosate is getting into biofuels. So we've had a real revolution over the past decade in developing methods to turn biomass into fuel. And of course, ethanol, for example, we have 10% ethanol in America in our gas. We're a leader in that space. We're trying to reduce petroleum consumption, and also the theory is that you would improve carbon emissions. So there's sort of motivation to develop technology to turn food crops into fuel. And so starting with the ethanol, the U.S. plays a leadership role there. We have 10% ethanol in our gasoline. Ethanol is derived from GMO Roundup ready corn. And ethanol in alcohol drinks like beer and wine have all consistently tested positive for glyphosate. So I'm suspecting there's glyphosate in the ethanol that's being burned in the gas tank. There's a question of whether burning it would break it, would break up the molecule. That's not clear because there are organic matter, there's organic molecules that get released in the exhaust fumes and are known to be toxic in diesel fuel in particular, and especially in biodiesel fuel. It turns out biodiesel is a fuel I didn't know about until just a month ago. So I'm a little green on this, and I've been trying to learn more about it in real time. Sort of, I feel like there's an urgency here to get this message out. I happen to notice that the places that where there are hotspots on COVID-19 very strongly, in my opinion, correlate with places where biodiesel is being burned in vehicles. And in particular, most striking perhaps is New York City, because New York City is by far the biggest hotspot in the United States. Huge problem there with COVID-19. People are getting serious lung problems and dying of asphyxiation or dying of sepsis or multiple organ failure. I mean, they're really getting terribly badly hit by COVID-19. And New York City has played a leadership role in the development of biodiesel fuel. There's three cities really that stand out: Washington, D.C., New York City, and New Orleans. And New Orleans, of course, has also been quite hard hit. New York City and New Orleans are both at the mouth of big rivers, the Hudson River for New York, and of course the mighty Mississippi for New Orleans. All kinds of toxic chemicals come down that Mississippi River. There's a big dead zone outside of it. New Orleans has a high rate of cancer. I mean, they have a high rate of obesity. It's a toxic space for sure in New Orleans. New York City, of course, very big metropolitan area, very easy chance of spreading the virus. Lots of people coming in from all over the world. So they've got those factors to consider, that they would get they would get exposed faster and sooner than other places because of those factors. But it's also, as I said, when you look at New York State, and there's all these different, I found a map that shows all the places in New York State where they process biomass into into fuel, biodiesel fuel, and other kinds of biofuel. And there's a whole bunch of them that clutter all around New York City. There's a lot of them in the city, around the city. That whole space has a lot of these plants that manufacture the biodiesel from the residue. So what we're doing in America, we're developing a technique to take the crop, what's left over after you harvest. So people argue it's really bad to turn food into fuel. So if you can first harvest the food, and then whatever's left over, turn that into fuel, then you haven't wasted the food. You haven't taken the food away from the dinner plate, which sounds really lovely, So they get the residue of the corn crop and the wheat crop after the harvest, and I think they probably pile it on these barges, all this biomass, and ship it down to New York City, and and feed into these plants where they turn it into biodiesel fuel. So those, wheat is routinely sprayed with glyphosate just before harvest as a desiccant. We have an epidemic in celiac disease, which I think is directly caused by glyphosate, the glyphosate contamination in the wheat. And then the corn is GMO Roundup Ready corn. So both of those are likely to have a lot of glyphosate residue in that biomass that's being turned into the biodiesel. And then the biodiesel is put into the engines of these vehicles, and they're being driven in New York City. There's 11,000 vehicles, I read, in New York City that are partially running on biodiesel fuel. So it sort of makes sense to me that people in New York City are breathing glyphosate from the fumes of the vehicles in the city, and that glyphosate is hitting their lungs and damaging it very badly. My studies show that glyphosate causes a deficiency in the innate immune system. And I talked about that in the paper. Very, very interesting. And then I connected it to the e-cigarettes, vaping fumes, which is very, very interesting because it turns out that e-cigarettes are based on glycerol. There's glycerol in there that's part of what makes an important component of those e-cigarettes. And the glycerol is manufactured from the residue after you've produced the biodiesel from the biomass in those factories. Wow. So the glycerol is likely also to have glyphosate in it. And I knew about this problem with the lungs that was showing up. I don't know if you've heard about that with the vaping.
Yeah, we've been following that, the vaping illness, as they've been calling it.
Yeah, very weird illness in the lungs, and nobody quite understands what's going on. And they've discovered it's connected to vaping very, very clearly, and they don't know. It's a mystery. It's a mystery as to why vaping is causing this. And what was really fascinating to me was a study that was done on rats, where they exposed the rats for 3 months to these vaping fumes, and then they exposed the rats to influenza virus. And they found that the rats that were exposed got a very intense reaction to influenza virus, which caused an overactive adaptive immune system, releasing all these cytokines and chemokines, and really hurting the lung tissue and damaging the lungs and causing this really specific problems, which was accumulation of fats inside the macrophages in the lungs. These the macrophages are the cells that go in to fight the disease. They accumulated fatty deposits, and they had defective surfactants. If surfactant proteins were defective in those, so they looked specifically at the lungs to see what was going on there. Instead of just saying, oh, they got sick, they were able to actually diagnose this weird condition where that these two things happened. Glyphosate's been shown to cause fatty liver disease in rats exposed to levels that are below regulatory limits. So glyphosate causes in the liver macrophages to accumulate fats when you're given it orally. So it makes sense to me the same thing would happen in the lungs if you're breathing glyphosate. It's going to cause the macrophages in the lungs to accumulate fat the same way and cause basically what you might call fatty lung disease, And then the surfactant proteins are extremely interesting because I had already researched those, and I've written some stuff up on it, which I have not yet published. I'm working on a book, and I'm hoping it will eventually come out on glyphosate. And in that book, I talked about glyphosate wrecking the innate immune system, and in particular by messing up a whole class of proteins. There's maybe a dozen of these proteins in this class that are called collectins. And what these proteins do is they bind to all kinds of debris, but including viruses. They bind to them and they basically hand them over to the macrophages so they can clear them. So they help the innate immune system to clear viruses. These surfactant proteins in the lung are members of this class, they have a particular specialty. These proteins have something called a collagen-like region that produces their stalk, which is very important for their function. And collagen is the most common protein in the body. Something like 25% of our protein mass is collagen. Collagen has long sequences of GXY, 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 where every third amino acid is a glycine residue. My theory about glyphosate, the insidious cumulative mechanism of toxicity of glyphosate that's so subtle, is that it's substituting by mistake for glycine during protein synthesis. So collagen, I think, is getting wrecked by glyphosate. It messes up its ability to form the beautiful triple helix that causes collagen to have its special properties. People are getting all kinds of problems with back pain and shoulder pain and knee surgery and hip replacement therapy and all these problems they're having with their joints. I think it's because glyphosate is messing up their collagen and causing those aches and pains. Eventually even leading perhaps to the opioid drug crisis that we're seeing today. So collagen in the tissues, but also collagen in these very important immune proteins that are produced by these macrophages to help fight viruses are messed up. And that means the virus gets, multiplies and gets out of hand. The adaptive immune system is called in with alarm bells, and it releases all these, basically trying to shoot the viruses because you can't trap them anymore. And shoot them with all these, toxic chemicals that are going to cause damage to the lungs. So that's what I think is happening. I think it's what's happening in vaping, and it's because of glyphosate. And I think it's happening in these cities where they're burning biodiesel fuel in their vehicles, the buses, the trucks, even the cars.
Wow, that's definitely a lot of great information there, and I hope everybody will go back and really listen to some of that information. We're going to, of course, put the paper you wrote in the description below so everybody can take a look at it.
That's
I've been
great.
sharing it around, and so what you're proposing here is, and I just want to make it clear because there's a lot of people calling alternative theories to the mainstream fake news and things of that sort. You're not proposing that the virus doesn't exist. And I think,
No, I'm not. I'm saying there's a virus, just like the flu virus, and it is an unusual virus. And there's a question of where it comes from too. I think there's a lot of controversy around where it came from.
yeah, no, absolutely.
Various theories floating around.
And we're hopefully going to get closer to that truth of what exactly, the origin of this. And in the meantime, though, I think the hypothesis you're putting forward is very important because even if we take it outside of the context of COVID-19, as you already understand, glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide in the world in the US, and people are exposed to it at unprecedented levels now. I often tell people in some of my presentations when talking about health and environmental toxins that I imagine if we took urine and blood tests, we would find traces of glyphosate in our systems because
No, I
especially
found it in mine. I mean, I've been eating organic diet for a long time, and I've tested positive for glyphosate in my urine. I mean, it's just impossible to avoid. I'm probably breathing it in the air in Cambridge. I mean, we live in Boston, which is also probably not a particularly healthy place to be in terms of the fumes, so we can't avoid it.
And the vaping connection I think is really interesting as well because I didn't know that about the glycerol and the connection to glyphosate, and of course it's become a growing trend, and people were getting sick last year, and I have seen some reports trying to connect saying perhaps COVID-19 was here last year and we just didn't realize it, and that's what the vaping illness is. But I think it's interesting the connection
That's an interesting thought.
yeah, I mean, and of course, we're trying to get to the bottom of it, right? And what exactly is the truth? But I think that it's undeniable that glyphosate is having an effect not only on human health, but obviously on the population of bees and the plants in general. And that ties into the whole, as you said, it's Roundup ready. So this is a Monsanto Bayer product that it's just being widely used, and we could get into that whole topic. But I'd like to hear more on the specifics of how glyphosate is, what the mechanism of how it affects the body and starts to break down these things, and as you said, could lead to autism or the immune system attacking itself. What are things that people should look out for as far as being exposed to glyphosate? Are there any indicators that someone might see that could let them know, okay, I'm having health problems, and it could be in relation to this chemical, this molecule here?
Definitely if they're having gut problems. I think that's a first indicator, because when you eat glyphosate contaminated food, it irritates your gut microbiome. It's been shown experimentally that it preferentially kills bifidobacteria and lactobacillus, which are really important microbes in your gut that keep you healthy. They do a lot of things for the host. And one of the things they do is they produce the aromatic amino acids. Those come out of the shikimate pathway, which is the pathway that glyphosate famously disrupts in the weeds to kill them. And it's extremely interesting science to me because you can get into the nitty gritty, but the exact enzyme that gets destroyed gets broken by glyphosate. I think it's getting broken by virtue of glyphosate getting in there in place of glycine. I mentioned that earlier. Glyphosate is a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine molecule. Glycine is the smallest amino acid. The amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And I think this is my theory that I'm having a lot of trouble getting anybody to believe, I have to confess. Most chemists think it's not possible, but I don't see why it's not possible, because it would fit perfectly into the spot for glycine and fool the protein into the one that's supposed to assemble glycine into the string. Proteins are built like paper dolls, on holding hands. Each paper doll is an amino acid, and there's about 20 of them. And there's the famous DNA code that codes for which one to put next in the sequence. And when the code says glycine, the machinery grabs the glyphosate molecule by mistake. It fits into the slot. It's got some extra stuff sticking out on its nitrogen atom, but that's okay. As long as it isn't big crowded amino acids around it, it can fit. It can fit into the sequence and get put there. But now it's got very different physical and chemical properties compared to glycine. Many, many proteins have absolutely critical glycine residues at particular spots. When you replace them with glyphosate, you break the protein, it doesn't work. And that's what's happening with the protein EPSP synthase. In the shikimate pathway, the glyphosate blocks. That protein, it has an essential glycine residue at the place where glyphosate messes it up. And glyphosate is substituting for glycine and preventing that protein from working. And people have found that if you mutate the protein, so you replace that glycine with alanine, that protein is completely immune to glyphosate at that point. So it's really, really pointing to that glycine residue as the critical thing in that protein that makes it susceptible to glyphosate. Once you say that's true, you can go find all these other proteins that also have essential glycines, and also at places that look like the place where that one is in the EPSP synthase. You can use that as a model, and you can find various proteins you can predict they would be affected, and then you find various diseases that are going up dramatically in step with glyphosate that are affected by those same proteins. So it really is a giant connect the dots excursion. But you hit gold. When you do that, you hit gold, which is why I'm very confident that I'm right.
Wow. Yes, it definitely seems like you're confident in this and you've done the research on it. I wanted to ask you, I mentioned this to you previously, that, like you said, you're having trouble getting people to accept your hypothesis and to look into this. And you have institutions like the American Council on Science and Health writing an article, MIT screwball blames glyphosate for COVID and everything else. Why do you think it is that there's this pushback to some of these theories? I mean, is it just that they think your science isn't right, or is there, other forces at work here?
My suspicion is that they have known, I suspect Monsanto executives and Monsanto researchers have known for a very long time that this is happening. Monsanto's own papers back in the 1970s showed that glyphosate was getting into the tissues of bluegill sunfish. They labeled the glyphosate, radio labeled it so they could track it. They saw there was glyphosate in the tissues because they saw the radio label. But when they measured for glyphosate, they didn't find it. They didn't find most of it. They only got like 20%. Once they broke up the proteins into individual amino acids using proteolysis enzymes, they recovered 70% of the label as glyphosate. And they said perhaps the glyphosate was incorporated into the protein. That is their words. And this was in the 1980s. So I think these people who are trying to make sure that everybody knows I'm a nutcase, I think they know this is what's happening. And they know that I'm a big threat, because if people figure this out, it's game over for glyphosate. It is going to be banned worldwide. And this is what I hope I live long enough to see that happen, because that's what needs to happen. It needs to happen. It should have happened 40 years ago. I mean, we've had this chemical on the market all these years, and everybody who starts eating, processed foods from America, they start getting fat. All around the world, they start getting fat. They start getting diabetes. We have a complete epidemic in diabetes. We can't figure out what's going on, To me, it's obvious. This chemical is extremely toxic, and it's toxic in a unique way. There's nothing else I know of that substitutes for glycine. There are other toxic amino acids that substitute for other amino acids and cause serious diseases like ALS. That's known, or metabolic disorder. These things are known. There are examples of non-coding amino acids that substitute for coding amino acids to cause disease. That's a known process. They're just saying that glyphosate can't do that. And I don't see why they're saying that, because it seems clear to me that it could. So, it's a frustrating battle for me, because I am getting Most people say, oh, glyphosate's safe. It's been shown. It's been proven. We don't have to worry. So I'm working against that. Most people think they just have a level of disbelief when I say something like this. How could we be poisoning ourselves to this extent and not know that we're doing it? How could we? It's just not possible. So there's a level of disbelief that it turns into denial. And so it's easier to just call me a nutcase than it is to accept that this is what's happening.
Yeah, I agree. And in my journalistic work over the last years, I've covered, we can go back to the 1980s and the EPA having documents themselves where they originally classified glyphosate as a carcinogen, and they originally recognized that it, has that there were health harms to it. Of course, that was later overturned, and now the opinion continues to be put forth that it's perfectly safe. And there's obviously some conflicts of interest that play a role there.
No kidding.
One final question I'd like to give you a chance to address is, what would you say is the weakest point in your hypothesis so far as connecting? Obviously, I would say that it's safe to establish, for anybody who's being honest, the dangers of glyphosate. But as far as the connection between glyphosate and COVID-19, what would you say is the weakest aspect of that theory?
Well, first of all, I think there's two things. One is just if you've been exposed to glyphosate, however, now you're sick, then you're more susceptible to COVID-19 because glyphosate does damage the lungs. That's been shown. I mean, people who try to kill themselves by drinking glyphosate, they end up with a lot of lung problems. And I should mention that the symptoms of that vaping disease are exactly the same as the symptoms of COVID-19. It's quite remarkable, exactly the same symptoms. So that's interesting. And you said, in fact, maybe that people are thinking maybe that was actually this virus. So people are thinking, oh my God, maybe the vaping thing was really this virus. Well, you have to think they're both being caused by the same thing. I think the weakest part is, could glyphosate survive all that processing? You come up with the biomass, you run it through this procedure that produces this oil, this biofuel, and then you burn it in this engine. And then after all of that, does it really come out into the vapor, or does it get destroyed, by the heat and whatnot? I think that's the weakest part. Does it in fact survive all of that processing to finally end up in the exhaust fumes of the vehicles? And this includes, by the way, the airplanes. I didn't mention that, but the airplanes have been adopting an aviation biofuel back since about 2010. United was the first to put it into their planes in Los Angeles. And now there's like 4 or 5 different airlines that are using partially aviation biofuel that fly into New York City. So, there's plenty of opportunity for the airplanes to also be spewing out glyphosate, if in fact it can, survive the combustion process. That is a huge question. So we need to have, like, for example, those fumes. There are people who've done experiments on biodiesel, and they found that biodiesel actually causes inflammation in the lungs, more so than regular diesel. So they know it causes inflammation, but they don't know why. They don't understand why. So again, if they can, and they've analyzed things in that biodiesel, but they never think to look for glyphosate. Nobody ever thinks to look for glyphosate. So people should hear me. People who are studying biodiesel should see if they can find glyphosate in it. That'd be the first thing to do. And then find glyphosate in the exhaust fumes that it produces. That's what needs to be done. That's doable. That's totally doable for the right people who have those skills and, the facilities to do that. And they should do that. I mean, they can prove me wrong, by not finding it. But they have to be careful because it could be embedded in the proteins, and you have to do the processing correctly to see it. Anthony Samsel has been measuring glyphosate in all kinds of things, and he has found if it's protein, you have to break those proteins down before you see the glyphosate, just as Monsanto found in their study on the bluegill sunfish. You have to break them down because otherwise it's embedded in the protein chain, the paper dolls. It's one of the paper dolls, and it doesn't show up as glyphosate unless you break it apart from its partners. That's crucial. So people could be getting a false signal of absence that would not be true. It would be present even though they didn't see it.
Wow. Yeah, well, I very much appreciate, bringing this knowledge to me and to my audience. I always feel like that for me, sharing these interviews is just my process of learning and trying to educate myself more about the world around us and sharing that with the larger audience. And I'm sure the audience will appreciate getting to know a bit about this theory. And of course, I will include both your paper as well as the paper calling you a screwball.
Sure.
If people want to see that and see what they're saying. I think it's a bit unfair of an assessment. You obviously have been studying this, and you do have the credentials to speak on this topic. Is there any particular place people can find some of your work, or anywhere you'd like to direct us?
Yes, I have my webpage at MIT, which is a little bit cumbersome. It's people, People, CSAIL, that's my lab, Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, CSAIL, .mit.edu / and then my last name, SENEFF. But if you Google my last name, you'll find all kinds of stuff. I've done many. I'm just trying to shout my message from the rooftop, and I sort of feel like a lone wolf in the wilderness sometimes, but
I definitely understand that. Well, we'll do what we can to
yeah.
get your message out there and to get some folks checking out your work, and we'll put the link to your profile there in the description below the video. Anything else you'd like to leave us with?
Stay safe and stay away from highways and eat certified organic food. I mean, that's going to be your best bet for protecting yourself from an acute outcome with COVID-19.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Guys, please do check out her work and check out the paper. I've shared it with you in the past week or so. I think it's very important for us to be considering these alternative theories and hypotheses to really understanding what we're facing, because there's so many different environmental toxins that are really out there that it's not as simple as pointing the blame as on just a virus itself. I think it's becoming more clear that the virus is being helped along by other toxins, and this could be a part of that puzzle. So thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.